What's up guys, it's Sir Thorn here, and welcome to the fourth and final part of my analysis of the ideal wrestling game. This will not only be the final part of this mini-series, but will also be the final analysis video for the year 2018. So I hope you guys had a good holiday season and that you'll have a happy new year. Anyway, let's continue with the game mechanics of the ideal wrestling game. Unlike most fighting games where you win simply by forcing your opponent beyond a certain damage threshold, wrestling games are usually won by means other than knockout. The most common win condition is by pinfall or submission. This is how damage is usually factored into the match's outcome. Being heavily damaged reduces the window of opportunity for you to kick out of pins, and it causes your button presses to give you fewer points when you're fighting to break out of submission holds. That is not what wrestling is like. As it stands, there is no selling going on in wrestling matches, except to the extent we see in the move animations themselves. Like, for example, if I execute this powerbomb, the opponent's head will bounce a little bit off the mat, but only because the head bouncing is just as much a part of that move's animation as the powerbomb itself. If I select this powerbomb, you can see that the opponent's head doesn't bounce as much. In modern wrestling games, selling is part of the move itself, not an inherent game mechanic. There are three key areas where you could use damage as a game mechanic outside of merely the match's finish: recovery, reversals, and offense. First, let's talk about recovery. Here's a clip from when a match starts. Notice, I run up and deck this guy with a clothesline. Let's see how long it takes this guy to get back to his feet. That, ladies and gentlemen, is pathetic. Considering that I have only done one move on him up to this point, he has no business taking this long to get up. That amount of time spent getting to his feet should be reserved for near the end of the match. A match that has gone over 15 minutes. By contrast, notice how quickly my opponent gets up when I do my comeback sequence. It just feels out of place that these guys are able to get to their feet immediately during this animation, yet they take forever to get to their feet whenever they're using the standard animation. In WWE 2K19, you gave us the instant recovery feature. Look how quickly this guy gets to his feet. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what should be the default recovery time when the opponent is still in green health. Hell, if you want to go the cheap route, you can just take the existing standing up mocap and either speed it up or slow it down. Alternatively, if you don't want the WWE 2K series to be realistic, then make it an arcade experience, but don't market this franchise as a simulation game if you aren't going to make it like the show. Next, we have the issue of reversals. In this clip, I just threw my opponent off the Hell in a Cell, and I'm about to pull a Shane McMahon and jump off the cell to attack him. Now, I couldn't get a clip where he would actually do this, but I do know from experience that he is fully capable of reversing my attack and moving out of the way. Somehow he is still fully conscious despite the fact that he just took a death plunge. Let's compare that to a moment in the show that everyone remembers to this day. This happened in 1998, and it is still talked about to this day. Here, have a look. That moment is one of the most legendary moments in wrestling history, and it's the moment that the stage toss move in the games is meant to recreate. But does anyone even remember what happened afterwards? For several minutes after that spot, what happened during the match was not a whole lot. I timed it. There was a total of 5 minutes and 37 seconds in between Foley's landing and the commentary team's observation that Foley was back on his feet. Sure, Mick Foley is legendary for his ability to take absolutely astronomical levels of abuse and still come back fighting again and again. As Jerry Lawler points out during this match,
there's a human being in there that is unbelievably indestructible. I never thought I would say that about somebody, but this guy is indestructible.
But not even Mick f***ing Foley was able to fall from the cell roof and just get right back up like he was f***ing Thor. In the games, if a wrestler sustains enough damage in a short period of time, they should be KO'd until their KO levels rise again. Unless KO is a win condition, it wouldn't instantly end the match, but it would make them unable to reverse attacks or wake up during a last man standing match. A character could still kick out of a pinfall attempt, although even then the amount of damage they have taken would still impair their ability to do that. To implement this mechanic, you could make it so that KO points are always going up, much like stamina recovery or reversal recovery. But every time you take an impactful move, that is, one that is classified as high impact rather than a mere strike or sunset flip, their KO meter goes down. The more impactful the move, the more KO points lost. If the KO meter goes below 0, the wrestler is knocked out until he manages to get back into the positives. During that time, however, he is completely at his opponent's mercy. This sounds way too easy to exploit, so to balance it out, their KO points would have to be a hidden number. That way players can't strategically exploit the KO unless they can mentally keep track of how many KO points their opponents still have. Also, the KO points lost while they are knocked out would have to be significantly reduced compared to when their KO points are in the positives, so as to make it much more difficult for opponents to keep you in a constantly KO'd state simply by spamming high-impact moves over and over again. Last but not least, the amount of KO points lost from a move should be randomly determined within a certain range, making it impossible for players to know with 100% certainty how close he is to knocking out his opponent. A third and final way that damage can affect the match is through offense. Specifically, those who have suffered a lot of damage should be debuffed according to the type of damage they suffer. For example, those who suffer arm or leg damage should have their limbs weakened so that they are less effective at delivering moves that use those limbs. So for example, if you're wrestling Zack Ryder, you might want to target his legs so that his broski boot and Rough Rider will do considerably less damage should he manage to hit them. Meanwhile, torso damage would increase the amount of stamina needed to do moves, and head damage can reduce your ability to reverse attacks even when you're not KO'd. Of course, let's also have extra debuffs if you can severely damage your opponent's body parts. For example, damaging the legs to dark red or greater could prevent that enemy from running. Damaging their arms or torso to dark red or greater could prevent them from lifting any opponents, forcing them to use exclusively non-lifting moves. And head damage can make them twice as susceptible to being KO'd. You get the idea. Get creative, and give us incentives to target specific body parts other than just making subsequent submissions easier. Now, speaking of damage, my next point. This is, admittedly, something that no wrestling game has gotten right up to this point, and in their defense, it hasn't exactly been feasible to implement until now. But with the addition of another mechanic I'm going to mention, I think it could work. In the 1990s and 2000s, submission holds in wrestling games were temporary holds. You had X number of seconds to make your opponent tap out, and if you hadn't damaged them enough to earn a submission, your character would automatically release the hold after the time had expired. This was completely immersion breaking. It made no sense why an offensive wrestler would voluntarily release a hold when he had his opponent dead to rights. The WWE 2K games changed it up a bit so that submission holds could only be released if the offensive player voluntarily canceled the hold. But that didn't mean that locking in a hold would necessarily result in a win. The offensive and defensive wrestlers were competing to fill up a meter while the hold was locked in. where the defensive wrestler escaped the hold if he filled it up first, but he tapped out if the offensive wrestler filled it up first. However, this is immersion breaking in its own right. Once a submission hold is locked in, it's actually fairly rare for a wrestler to actually be able to break the hold. Instead, in the actual show, most submission holds were treated as hard to lock in unless you had damaged your opponent enough already. For example, Natalya can often be seen attacking her opponent's legs in her matches, while the commentary team points out that she's softening her opponent up for the sharpshooter. Some people have complained that the sharpshooter hurts her opponent's back and not her legs, but that's not the point. The point is that she's damaging her opponent's legs so that her opponent can't counter the hold when she goes to lock it in. So here is my proposal to make submission in wrestling more like the show. First, have there be a minigame to lock the hold in addition to applying the pressure after the hold is applied. The defensive wrestler would be at a huge disadvantage in the first minigame if their limbs were already damaged. See my aforementioned body damage debuff system for details. But you first have to pass the first minigame in order to fully lock in the hold. However, once the hold is locked in, tapping out should be optional, just like in the show. This is a flaw in both submission systems. We can't recreate legendary moments like Austin versus Bret Hart at WrestleMania 12, and it is completely ridiculous that we can submit guys like Steve Austin or The Undertaker, guys who were famous for their refusal to submit to anyone, and we can just make them tap out as easily as any other wrestler. Now, I understand the reason you make tapping out automatic. Players would have no reason to tap out, because they have no reason to throw the match. However, in the My Player mode, you can force players to tap out on their own by having the potential for career-ending injuries. If they get severely injured, their My Player comes to an end. They then have to recreate an entirely new My Player character and start all over again from scratch. Even if their injury isn't career-ending, they should be forced to sit out a certain amount of days in real time before they can get back into the road to glory again. Does that sound harsh? Maybe it is, but then again, I would have no objection if you wanted to make this feature optional. Perhaps you could make it as part of a hardcore mode, kind of like the equivalent of Fallout 4's or Skyrim's Special Edition's survival mode, something for only the most hardcore fans. This hardcore mode could also include things like having to manage your wrestler's finances, including his diet and workout, balance his personal relationships with his wrestling career, and so on and so forth. Online players would only be matched up with those with the same settings as them to ensure someone doesn't get an injury when they weren't supposed to have that setting turned on. Even if you don't manually tap out of a submission hold, an offensive wrestler should still at least be able to obtain a victory by knockout if the defensive wrestler passes out during a submission hold. Shades of Austin vs. Hart at WrestleMania 12. This way, you can get submission wins against characters who never tap out. Last but not least, I would like for a human-controlled referee to be able to call for a submission victory as soon as the submission hold is locked in, rather than when an opponent taps out. If you're even a casual wrestling fan and don't instantly know what infamous moment I'm thinking about right now, then I feel sorry for you. We're coming up to the end of this 4-part miniseries, but before I close it out, I would like to make some requests for some things that were too small to have their own section. First, I like how dirty pins are now an ability you can perform by holding the pin button rather than tapping it. In previous games, dirty pins were entire moves unto themselves. However, I still think the dirty pin mechanic can be greatly improved. Ideally, I would like to see the ability to perform dirty pins from any location, not just when your opponent is just the right distance from the ropes and just the right angle parallel to them. If you're too far away from the ropes for that variety of the dirty pin, then let me do a dirty pin by hooking the tights rather than hooking the ropes. Speaking of cheating to win, I would like to see ref bumps take longer to recover from. As it stands, if I want to use a weapon, I first have to bring the weapon into the ring, then deck the referee with a running strike, then pick the weapon back up and hit my opponent with it. If I knock the referee out and then go for the weapon, the referee will be back up before I get the chance to hit my opponent with it. The only exception is when my opponent is already on the outside of the ring. When the referee is knocked down, he should take, at a minimum, 30 seconds before he even begins his getting back to his feet animation, and even then the animation should be much longer than that of a wrestler. Even after he makes it to his feet, he should count a pinfall much slower than he would if he weren't knocked out, just as referees on the show do. In addition to the referee being knocked out via running strikes or being clipped by an Irish whip, I would also like to see a ref bump OMG moment. You could have it be triggered from the standing in front position, and it couldn't be equipped at the same time as the powerbomb into a Boston Crab OMG moment. This would be used to knock the referee out indefinitely, until one of the wrestlers manually revives him, or at the very least have him be down for several minutes to allow quite a bit of unhindered cheating. Last but not least, I would like to see an increased use of the modifier button. R1 by default has historically been the modifier button in WWE 2K games, but it has only been used to about 1% of its full potential. As I pointed out in my minigame series about the ideal Elder Scrolls 6, I believe the modifier button is a great addition to any gaming franchise, and I would like to one day see it become a staple of video game controls, right alongside how you press start to pause the game. The modifier button effectively doubles the amount of buttons that are on the controller, and I would like to see its use expanded greatly. Perhaps you could even have L1 become a second modifier button, thereby effectively quadrupling the number of buttons on the controller. A face button could perform up to 4 different functions independently of whether you have L1, R1, or both or neither held down when you press it. I would like to see the modifier button be used for a variety of different scenarios, not just during OMG moments or limb target moves. Imagine being able to switch between heel or face promos on a dime simply by holding down the modifier button. Imagine being able to get different weapons from under the ring with the modifier button held down. In WWE 2K18, you introduced the ability to cancel a pin attempt by pressing up on the D-pad, but in such a way that the kick out animation played out. Imagine if you could press R1 and then up on the D-pad, so that your opponent would kick out and your character would act shocked at the kick out. Obviously, this would be done more for storytelling and role-playing purposes than for actually winning a match, but then again, pressing up on the D-pad to force your opponent to kick out of the pin is already more for storytelling and role-playing purposes than for actually winning the match, so what's the big deal? Remember rule of thumb number 2. All in all, the important thing is to get creative and greatly expand the use of the modifier button. I would love to see its use expanded practically indefinitely. And that concludes my 4-part mini-series on the perfect wrestling game. Hopefully you guys found this series engaging, and perhaps my suggestions caused you to think of a few mechanics you would like to see as well. If you enjoyed this mini-series, be sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Also, please post a comment telling me what you think. I welcome people to disagree with me, as long as you're civil about it. Also, check out some of my Let's Plays on this channel, where I take a more lighthearted approach to these games and just have a good time. And if you would like to see more in-depth analysis of your favorite video games, be sure to hit that subscribe button. In the meantime, however, I am Acer Thorn, and I will see you guys later.